Mr Acting Deputy President, I move business of the Senate notice of motion number 1, standing in my name for today. It's worthwhile understanding a little bit of history as to why this disallowance has been lodged. In response to an Inspector General of Transport Security report, the government announced back in May 2018 an intention to upgrade security at regional airports. All senators and most Australians would be familiar with the sort of equipment that would be installed in these airports: body scanners, luggage screening equipment and so forth. They also announced a $50 million grant fund to cover the capital costs of the equipment across more than 50 airports. All good so far. I'll just park that there and then go back also a couple of years to a Senate committee that was running in parallel to all of this, inquiring into the operation, regulation and funding of air route delivery to rural, regional and remote communities. It was an inquiry, and I have to pay considerable applause to the senators involved back there, Senator Barry O'Sullivan and Senator Glenn Sterle as well participated in that inquiry and played a big part in it. I also sat on that committee, and it was during that committee we were made overtly aware of this particular plan and a number of holes that were in the plan, holes in the execution of it. Now, the first hole was a shortfall in funding for some of these regional airports. And I will talk about Whyalla on a couple of occasions tonight, but Whyalla Airport is a good example. If you want to install equipment into Whyalla Airport, firstly you've got to have a big enough terminal. And Whyalla Airport is not that big. And it's particularly important if you want to have both screened and non-screened flights. It requires a larger terminal so that you can have a cleared area and a screened area. Certainly the funding that was made available didn't contemplate that, and I will acknowledge that the government has moved in terms of ground and in respect of that to help out some airports in relation to terminal modifications. But perhaps the biggest problem was the fact that there was no funding to cover the operational expenses, the operational costs. And the interesting thing was, and the committee basically revealed that, was that there were no studies done. Someone inside Home Affairs looked into the security issue, made a decision, and I'm sure there are good reasons for those decisions, and the committee were briefed to a certain extent in relation to that, in relation to those reasons, but no one looked at the problem holistically. No one looked and said, what effect does this have? And in fact, there was no RIS carried out either, which makes me wonder whether or not the Office of Best Practice Regulation is in fact doing their job properly, because we now know that for Whyalla, for example, the cost is well over $1 million each year to run, which is a doubling of the cost of the operational cost for the airport per annum. Now, what happened was there was no studies that were done, and as a result, and this was the good work of the committee, and once again, former Senator Barry O'Sullivan played a big part in this. We impressed upon the Department of Transport that they had to do some case studies, and off they went to do some case studies. But just to conclude, and it's really important in the context of this disallowance, what the inquiry found, and it won't come as any surprise to anyone who's gone anywhere near the bush, that airfares to regional and remote communities are high. And the other factor that we need to take into consideration is that regional air routes are the lifeblood of regional communities. It's the way in which we get medical services to the bush. It's the way in which we get medical services to regional centres. It's the way in which people who in regional centres hook up with education services. It's the way businesses, it's the way agriculture connect up with suppliers in the cities, and indeed it's the way in which families make connections with people in the cities. And what the committee found was that you can have a situation where if a doctor ends up getting frustrated about not being able to get back to Adelaide or to Brisbane or to Perth on a regular basis because of the expense, and it is hugely expensive for people in the bush to get their families to the cities, they leave. And when the doctor leaves, suddenly 3 teachers decide to pack up and go because they don't want to live in a town where there's no doctor. And we know right across this country there are problems in relation to doctors being available in regional communities. So it really is important that we make sure that air routes are maintained, air services are maintained to these regional centres. We took evidence from both Qantas and Rex and Virgin, but with my focus on South Australia, Qantas made it very clear that there's not a lot of margin on each seat. You increase the fare by just a little bit, and suddenly there's no profit for the airline. Rex was very, very prescriptive about it. They said that they operate, and evidence to the committee, the RAC committee last week, made it very clear: $10 per seat. That's what they make for every seat for every flight, if averaged over a year. So if you put up, if you impose a charge upon a local council, because that's who mostly operates these airports, what then happens is they pass that on by way of landing costs to the airline, and the airline passes it on to the passenger. And you have a situation where, when the airfare goes up, what happens is, particularly in some of these remote areas, the competition to the airline is not necessarily between Qantas and Rex. It's actually between, say, Rex and the road. And people then take to the road, and that causes a number of problems in terms of safety, in terms of people being tired. Someone who needs to get to a medical appointment and they have to drive 7 or 8 hours to get to that appointment. It actually creates a more dangerous situation. And I'm not kind of making this up. I believe the airlines. In just over the last 4 or 5 months in South Australia, and this is before COVID, we saw Rex pulling services out of Mount Gambier. We saw Rex announcing it was leaving Kangaroo Island. We've seen the cessation of flights to Port Augusta. Now, we have to look beyond our capital cities. The people in the bush, they're fantastic people, and they're doing a whole range of stuff to supply us with food, supply us with fabrics, all that sort of stuff, and they're really important. And we cannot continue to just lump cost upon them. We cannot continue to make things harder for them. I'll go to the study that resulted from the pressure that came from the RAC committee, the 2018 RAC committee inquiry. There has been a Transport Department set of case studies done, and the two I've focused on, this won't surprise you, is Whyalla. First is Whyalla. The airfares in Whyalla, and these are not my numbers, these are the Department of Transport's numbers. The airfares in Whyalla will go up by $52 per passenger. This is already on top of the very expensive fares. The RAC committee heard last week that it's cheaper to fly from Adelaide to Bali than it is to fly from Adelaide to Whyalla. And that is the evidence that the committee received. And of course, that's an unacceptable proposition. What will happen if this if this regulation is allowed to continue, is we will see services dropped from Whyalla. There is no question. We will, just as people like Sanjeev Gupta are trying to put their foot on the accelerator there, we'll have the government putting on the handbrake. And we also took evidence from Armidale last week, and they were kind of all okay about it until they realised that in Armidale, or in fact, I asked the CEO, what's the increase in ticket price as a result of the security screening? He said, "Oh, I'm not really sure, Senator." Then we had Air Corporate come on, who fly into Armidale, and they made it very clear that the air route most at risk in their little network was in fact an Armidale to Brisbane flight. They said it's on the rocks. That's a quote. It'll be on the rocks. So, but now we have a situation. We've got COVID-19. And the entire aviation industry has been turned upside down, completely turned upside down. We've had one of the two major carriers in this country go into liquidation, or sorry, into administration. I apologise. And we're having to prop up Qantas and Rex and other carriers to make sure we've got at least some limited services going to our regional centres. And I compliment the government on their response in relation to COVID-19. However, there's no question that what's going on here is unfair. It's unfair to people that live in the regions, and it will harm them. It will be devastating for them. They will lose services. This is just another sort of chipping away at regional areas. And at the end of it, we look back and we say this was a bunch of bureaucrats that made these decisions without proper consideration as to the effect. People who clearly don't get outside of the territorial limits of Canberra. So I want to make it very clear. My disallowing or seeking a disallowance of this regulation is not about airport security. It's not about airport security. I support airport security. It's about sharing cost. It's about being fair about how we distribute costs. I'd make the point in terms of security that we've got people now in the regions that are paying for security where the threat is actually at the city when they arrive, most likely. So we've got people in the regions now putting their hand into their pocket, paying extremely high airline air ticket costs, and they're doing so in the interest of the people in the cities. This is a national security requirement. It should not be a local council cost. It should be looked at nationally, and I acknowledge that there are a number of people in this place that have contributed and helped to examine this. That includes Senator Sterle. Senator McDonald, the chair of the RAC committee, has done a good job in teasing out all of these issues. We actually are well aware of what's going to happen here. We need to be we need to protect those people in the regions. We need to stand up for those people in the regions, and so I ask senators to vote for my disallowance.